Okay, so today we're going to be looking at Mao's consolidation of power, part four, but the focus and emphasis will be on Mao's grip of power um, from 1955 to 76. Starting off with the registration system. So Mao was growing in power, the CCP was growing in power. Um, so the state took more control of the countryside, and there's a famine that's going on, so a lot of peasants are actually leaving the countryside and abandoning it for urban areas. And so in order to kind of just slow it down, or put a halt to it, at least temporarily, was to have a registration system where basically you had to register, and you really had to ask for permission to go and live in a different area of China during this time. Again, this had already existed prior to Mao, but they used it in order to kind of, stop the bleeding of people leaving and not having anybody working these industries. Um, and so it was used as a way to get a little bit more control over the the people in China. Next slide. So another thing that's happening, we have to put this into the context. So the Cold War is a thing that's happening at this moment. Um, it's there's a lot of tension. Okay. And so Stalin dies, a new Soviet Union leader eventually comes in, Nikita Khrushchev. So we will be learning about him a good amount next semester when we hit the Cold War like crazy. That's the only thing we're going to be looking at next semester. But basically, uh, Khrushchev denounced, basically said, like, what Stalin was doing was not good. He had a cult personality behind him, and a lot of, he did a lot of things, purges, mass deportations, and so Nikita Khrushchev was like, nah, that's not good. He didn't drop any names outside of that, but basically what Khrushchev was saying rang across the world in all of the Soviet satellites or communist satellites and radio stations, and so people heard that, and Mao was one of the people that heard it. And even though, like I said, he didn't drop any names outside of just Stalin, Mao heard that and it's like, you know what, I'm gonna make this about me. He didn't mention me, but I'm gonna make it about me. And so he felt offended, in that he saw that Khrushchev attacking Stalin's cult personality and the way that he was, in power, was an attack on Mao's form of you know being the leader of China, right? So this basically caused a lot of tension, especially in China. People were kind of questioning what Mao was doing, especially since there was some criticism behind what Stalin was doing. And so Mao kind of just steps back in order to steer away the criticism from him and kind of just let other people take charge. So he kind of goes into the background for a little bit. But he, one of the things that he implements is this campaign, the 100 Flowers campaign. And so basically the slogan was, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend. And this was to kind of, encourage people to criticize or just have critiques or feedback on the country, on the party, and just what's happening, right? And so at first people were kind of hesitant, and at first people were like, oh, well, maybe this could be better, or maybe we could do it this way instead, right? Um, and so a lot of people started engaging in that, and it started to get more and more intense. And so you start to see a lot of people who are trying to purposely destabilize the party, um, say really, really harsh things. And so those people ended up being labeled as rightists. Okay, so there's this thing, as a response to all of this getting out of hand, the criticism getting out of hand, there's this thing called the anti-rightist movement, that basically forced his biggest critics to take back their criticism, right? So people who, like I said, were trying to destabilize things or just kind of really take over and shift everything were labeled that. So a lot of people were, 500,000 people were given that label. In response, there's some people who did commit suicide. You also have to understand, though, the way that people handle things in different regions of the world might be different from how we handle things and labels and things like that. Okay. One of Mao's most loyal supporters was forced to confess that he had slowed down the reforms, and that's something that did happen. And so a lot of these people who were labeled as rightists, like I said, they were people who were voicing things to destabilize the party, either by causing uncertainty or slowing it down, right? Were there mistakes in people who were labeled this? Probably yes, right? And people who, like I said, who did commit suicide, um, that was their response. Maybe our response by being labeled as haters here in the United States might be a little bit different, but that was their response for whatever reason. Okay. The only way to kind of get on good terms with Mao is to basically just kind of follow him. And so that's something that you kind of want to think about in terms of when you compare Mao with other leaders. How does that compare to what Castro was doing when there was criticism, or how does that compare to Nasir, right? Um, a lot of historians interpret this moment in history in a few ways. So some believe that this was a trick by Mao to kind of expose people, right? It's like, oh yeah, yeah, go ahead and say whatever you want, and then when you say it, it's like, aha, I got you, right? But that's just one interpretation by a certain group of historians. Other historians kind of disagree with that and just kind of say um, it was done with the idea of getting feedback and criticism, but it grew out of hand, right? And so it got it out of their control, and that's not what they wanted, right? They did want a little bit of this and a little bit of that with some control so that there wouldn't be any chaos. Another perspective, though, is the idea that there was confusion about what this campaign was really about, and so there was a lack of communication about what the end goal was. Either way, though, at the end of the day, Mao did end up growing in power as a result. One of the people that ended up under threat during this time is Peng Duhai. Duhai, I think that's how you're gonna say it, okay? Um, he basically was one of the people that was encouraging fighting against or just kind of destabilizing Mao's leadership and policies in the famine. The famine is rightfully so something that needed to be criticized, right? But I think the way that you approach it really determines what side of Mao you're going to end up on, right? Whether it's like, we got to get rid of Mao and we got to get rid of this, all of these leaders, and just kind of creating chaos. So he went to a conference and he encouraged people to speak out, and nobody did. Everybody was like, no, bro, like, we're in a harsh situation. The famine is happening, yes, and there were mistakes made, but there's also a lot of natural disasters that are happening in this time as well. That's, you know, magnifying the famine in itself. Okay, so Peng failed to get a lot of people against Mao, which is what he was doing, and so he was labeled as a troublemaker for the political party, the CCP, because he did belong to the party. So it's like, how are you gonna belong to this party and yet at the same time get people to kind of go against it, right? And so he was kicked out. Um, he was kicked out of his position, not of the party. So there's that. At the same time, you have the Tibetan uprising. The famine ends up reaching Tibet because it's going to reach obviously multiple areas in China. Tibet, as we know, has a history of rising against China because they want to keep the old system in place that encouraged feudalism. And so with mixing the old traditions and wanting to bring back the old traditions, mixing the famine, all of that, it's chaos, right? You're gonna have people butting heads between each other. So the PLC, the People's Liberation Army, backed by the CCP, going in and clashing with the Tibetan army or the Tibetan rebels, right? At this time, the Tibetan religion is coming under attack and was basically being banned or at least forbidden from being practiced out in the open. This is at the same time, around the same time, where we see a lot of reforms with marriage, right? So it's contradicting a lot of what they believe in terms of, oh, a woman can get divorced if she wants to, a woman is going to be seen as equal. So a lot of Tibetan monks were like, hell no, we're not going to see women as equal. And so it's just like, again, adding more, wood to the fire. Okay. And then they, again, getting, redistributing land, because at this time they're still redistributing the land from the rich and giving it to the former slaves as well. The Dalai Lama is banned at this point. He is living in exile in India. There's like a whole new Dalai Lama at this point, but yes. And so you end up imprisoning a lot of people, a lot of the higher system, the higher ranked people in Tibet who want to keep that old system in place as well. Okay, we're almost done. So this next section looks at the Cultural Revolution. We'll continue with that tomorrow, but there's 2 slides that we need to get through really quick. So in 1962, Mao slipped into the background as a result of the damage from the famine, but also the talking of the trash of Khrushchev, right? So instead, we have President Liu and General Deng Xiaoping, who were tasked with basically kind of reversing some of these things and kind of stabilizing the country and stopping the famine. And they did. They did manage to do that. But Mao kind of sees this as a threat to him and sees it as a reverse back to what was the system before, right? Because Deng Xiaoping and Liu are a little bit more on the moderate side, and they're not all the way to the left like some of the other party members are. Okay, so this new direction just kind of he launched the great proletarian cultural revolution, where it's kind of like we have to reestablish ourselves and reestablish like nationalism in follow the Chinese Communist Party. And so this causes a lot of pain and chaos because there's a lot of people who are resistant to it still because they still want that old system. And there's a lot of purges happening within the party where people are being kicked out of the party and being exiled from the party. Last one, the Little Red Book. We're going to look into more detail into the Little Red Book, but basically, Lin Biao, he's going to be very important in the next coming lectures. But basically, he was considered Mao's most loyal supporter. He wrote the Little Red Book. It's just a compilation of a bunch of like thoughts by Mao and his sayings and everything. And so, it's tiny. It's pocket size. You can put it into your pocket and walk with it anywhere. And that was the purpose of it, right? You're not gonna want to carry a big book around everywhere. It's easier to carry a little notebook that's the size of a phone, right? Today. And basically it gives instructions on how to act according to the teachings of Mao, the teachings of the Chinese Communist Party, all these things, right? And it kind of like instills nationalism and importance in what you're doing and brings pride to the people, right? So soldiers were given this. The PLA soldiers were given these little books as a training guide, right? Because if you're serving your country, you might as well have the ideals of the country at the time, right? So, and in addition to that, it just overall it sold over 750 million copies through China. Even today, that the number of copies is probably trillions, right? And even people outside of China own this book, read this book, and use this book as a basis of the foundation for their ideology. Okay, but in China, for our sake, this book was used in schools, at home, and was always a reference in discussion. And it just kind of heightened Mao's image at that point. But that's all we're gonna say. That's all I need to say for today. Have a good day. See you later. Bye.